Thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you for having me on Mentor Chat. Um, so I thought I would tell you a bit about sort of my origin and journey in science policy, and then kind of end up talking a little bit about my current role, um, because I identify most strongly as a boundary spanner. So I started my career in science. I have a PhD from the University of Washington. I studied jellyfish biomechanics. And so what does jellyfish biomechanics have to do with science policy? So this is sort of part of the whole long and nonlinear journey towards the career space I ended up in. So I loved being in science. I loved the opportunity to connect the science that I was doing to the world. And I realized, I think, about 3/4 of the way through my PhD, that those moments, the moments where I got to sort of step back and tell the story and put the science in context, were fewer and far between. And, while I loved what I was doing in the lab, I really liked the context and trying to kind of anchor the science that I was doing in society and in the real world. And at the time, and this will speak to some of the questions I know that, I saw you raised about pathways. Like, so what do you do? And this was, I think, the options now, there are tons more kind of career options if you you don't want to stay in traditional academic science, but you don't know exactly where you want to go from there. But at the time, it wasn't clear to me what a pathway to either a career in science policy or a career in science journalism or a career at the boundary might look like, or really how to get there. And so, once I sort of had this moment in grad school, which was sort of the, okay, I don't want this traditional path. What do I do next? I decided that what I would try to do is think about my post PhD period as an opportunity to do kind of a non-traditional postdoc. And, what would that look like? And, this is I'm framing it still in the academic language because I needed to, finally fess up to my advisor that, in fact, this was a path and a journey detour that I was going to take that might not look conventional in the academic world. And at the time, so I was at the University of Washington, and at the time, it was only in the College of Engineering that there were classes in science communication. And so I kind of snuck off during, one spring semester in grad school and started taking classes in technical writing and science communication. And I worked in the environment space. I also got to know the director at the Washington Sea Grant program. And he encouraged me. He's like, so it sounds like, between science journalism and science policy, you really want to try to figure out how to get your feet wet in these different fields. And so that's what I did. I sort of set out to treat my postgraduate time as an exploratory period in both the fields of science journalism and in science policy. And following the completion of my PhD, I ended up I was an intern at Science Magazine for 6 months. And then following that, I was a science policy fellow through the Washington Sea Grant program, so the Knauss Marine Policy Fellowship Program on Capitol Hill. And so this was a really, really quick immersion from the world of journalism, or from the world of academia to journalism and policy. And it was incredible to, I think, get a sense of the competencies of cross-cultural communication between journalism and policy. And they have a lot in common. There are certain things that are different, but I think what I realized, and this is sort of coming back to this role as a boundary spanner, is that this space in between the disciplines really draws on everything that as a communicator about needing to understand your audience and figure out where you fit in relation to them. So a little bit more specifically about science policy, I don't want to go into sort of like play-by-play around my career path, but as Maddie said, I've worked in both science journalism and in science policy, and my most recent career path has been working right in the intersection. So the past 8 years, I worked with Compass, so an organization that works to directly train scientists to connect more effectively with policymakers. And now in my current role at the National Council for Science and the Environment, I am doing something similar, but at a different scale. So NCSE, for short, we represent a consortium of over 100 universities, and we're connected by the deans and directors of programs on the environment. And I came into this new role in September, specifically with the goal of building a new science policy portfolio that works to connect the science coming out of the 100-member institutions to decision-making at different scales, from local to federal. And we also have an effort internationally, although I'm not working on the international component right now. So maybe I'll take a breath there, because there are a lot of different places I can go and talk about, both within science policy. I've had a bunch of different roles, and also at the boundary, and just kind of hear from you guys about what's most interesting, and then we can dive down some different paths.
I think what I would, Erica, before we open her up for questions, I'm interested just like, can you give us an example of what's your day like? I'm sure there's very different, but like maybe like some things that you do on a regular basis.
Sure. I'll start with a day in my life in my current role, but I think it would also be helpful to share. I also spent sort of in various roles. I spent 6 months working at the White House Council on Environmental Quality back in 2014. So that's another kind of different day in the life that gives a better sense of the policy environment. But in my current role, like I said, because this is a new position, and it's really looking specifically to build out the capacity of the university community to connect to decision making, I spent a lot of time kind of with my ear to the ground in both communities. So I talked to a lot of scientists within our network of member universities. I talked to a lot of decision makers, and in particular, one kind of neat thing. In January, our network of universities, so NCSC, merged with another network of institutions of 150 local governments. So one of the specific aspects of the program I'm building right now is to try to think about ways to create the connective tissue, frankly, between the university communities and the local government communities. And what that will take is quite a lot of intensive boundary spanning, because I think one thing I would like to, make sure it comes through clearly is that policy is not a monolith. It's very, very context specific. And so any decision maker at any scale of government is likely to have tons of different issues on his or her plate. And how do you find the place and the opportunity for science to connect with those kinds of issues is, it's nuanced. So your audience is way more specific than sort of like the target audience for journalism, where you basically have a general sense of who your readership is. The audience for a policy decision, that can be very, very specific. So a lot of the work I do right now is trying to get specific about who needs to hear what, when, and who are the best messengers. So I know that sounds a little bit vague, but in terms of a day in the life, it means a lot of meetings, a lot of phone calls. Days that I sort of consider my field work are, when I'm sitting in DC, so I spend time going up to the Hill and doing meetings up there. Lots and lots and lots of groups come through DC, so it's just a great place to be engaging in person. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. If you guys want to put your little paws up, I can start calling on people to ask questions. Okay. Yeah. Nancy, what do you got? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Or I can unmute you. Let me see. All right, Nancy, I'm unmuting you. Prepare yourself. Okay. You can go. If you want. 3, 2, 1, do it. Okay. Zoom is hard. Nancy, if you just want to put your question in the chat as well, if your microphone's acting a fool, you can do that. Who else has a question? I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I know since you guys emailed us 17 questions.
And I'm happy to just start, going through some of the ones I know you emailed me, but
yeah, maybe while we get warmed up.
All right. So I loved this question about what are the key skills from graduate school that make you marketable for science policy. I think that's a really interesting one, because I was thinking about this a lot. I actually think it's not about understanding policy per se. It's really the skills you're building as being part of this community, the SciComm community. It's effective science communication, really cultivating an active listening, like being able to really understand where other people are coming from and trying to understand the contexts and the environment that people are working in. So I think, a lot of the transferable skills are the ones are more so the ones in communication than are necessarily in direct policy. I think certain things are helpful, like understanding around statistics and data and just kind of how science shows up in the policy space. I've been thinking more and more, I wouldn't say this is a prerequisite, but I've been thinking a lot more about if I could go back and do it again in grad school, I would get a lot more proficient with maps and GIS. Decision makers love maps. So the ability to kind of interact in a visual and a spatial way has a really high impact. So the more you're able to tailor a science answer to a jurisdiction, a basin of watersheds, just like thinking about the decisions in space and in time, and so the skills that lend themselves to that. So that was one question. I see a question coming in on the chat. Okay, so what was the entry point for contacts and fellowships? So this is a good question, and and I appreciate the question around, do you have to get a high level fellowship from like AAAS to make this leap? So two thoughts there. Certainly having an immersive experience in some way, like going and spending time in a policy environment, teaches you more than you could possibly learn by reading or talking to. That said, there are way more ways of doing that now than there were when I first started out. So yes, a lot of the fellowship opportunities are still great pathways. So the AAAS I mentioned, I was a Knaus Marine Policy Fellow, which was a competitive application process. But more and more, there are more opportunities at the state and local level. And I think the just getting in there and spending time in those environments, like, so anybody can go to a county council meeting, so a community meeting, getting out in your community and figuring out where policymakers are and where they're convening, and just kind of showing up and spending time and hanging around. So there are formal and there are informal ways of kind of getting that experience and access. And like I said, originally, policymaking it's not a monolith. So I spent time on both the Hill and then a lot later in the White House, and there were very, very, very different experiences. They have certain things in common, but really thinking about, who are you when you're interested in policy? What does that mean specifically? Are you interested in certain kinds of changes you want to see in the world? Who are the people who are making decisions that affect those kinds of changes? I don't know if that helps answer it. And I can provide some specifics around ideas and resources. I think more and more, I would say especially in the past 3 years, there's just been an explosion of new groups supporting young scientists and students interested in starting out and engaging in science policy, and new sort of opportunities to connect the dots.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I'm kind of interested in, and again, if anybody has questions, just hit participants and raise your hand. Okay, here we go. I've got a couple coming in. Okay, Nancy, I'm gonna raise your question because you asked first. Mm-hmm. Can you speak about how crucial the PhD is to working in science policy?
So great question. It depends on where you want to end up in science policy. So in some ways, not crucial at all. Many policymakers have, minimal, environmental policymakers will not have certainly PhD level policy background. That said, from my perspective and in the role I've been in, its value has come in mostly in being able to be an effective and credible broker between the two communities. So I spent, most of my career really, with one foot in the science community and one foot in the policy community, and being able to effectively straddle that boundary and be kind of authentic and credible in both. That's how it's helped the most. within certainly my, my specific field of the biomechanics of jellyfish locomotion has never come up in a policy meeting. The only time I've brought it up is in, in the introduction. But that said, my comfort with, I know how scientists work. I know how the reward structure within academia is very, very, very different than the policy community. And I know why it's hard for scientists to engage. And so trying to, in the role I've played in facilitating those connections, being sensitive to kind of the constraints and pressures that are inherent in academia, as well as understanding kind of the drivers and pressures that policymakers are under, I think makes for an effective broker. But that said, that's more how I've, years later thought about critically what a PhD has given me. It's not like I would say it's a prerequisite to any of these career paths, because I think there are tons of different ways to get in. If that makes sense.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay, so we've got another one. Do people in science policy tend to cover a broad basis of science, or do they focus in one specific area? I'm sure that's different for different people.
Yeah, so very much it depends. So if you are take Capitol Hill for example, you can have a legislative assistant who will have both all three of those, environment, healthcare, and technology, as part of their portfolios. Or you may have you may work with a committee, and this is, again, I'm just speaking at the federal level, a committee that's really focused on a very much more narrow subset of legislation in one space, for example, the environment. So it depends. I would say that on balance, decision makers tend to have more breadth on their plates than depth. The exception being within sort of the agencies, the state and federal agencies, you'll have more specific focused areas.
Awesome quote. We've got, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, I'm reading. I can see the chat too, but go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, go. Yeah. All right, go ahead. You can read the political.
The chat coming in. So what are some of the political hurdles consistently that make communicating science more difficult? Well, recently, quite a lot, I think. But I do think, because I can sort of, I've been in it long enough that sort of a lot of the challenges around communication, they're not new, they're just intensified in this climate. And so in the current climate around the degree to which there's such distrust around information and fact and what even science does, I think it's become a lot more hard. Everything's just become more intense, but it's not necessarily new. What I think about and what I tell people around this is, I think now more than ever, it's really important in these kinds of interactions with decision makers to be able to establish a common ground about what science is and what it isn't. So as much as you're sharing your result, you're sharing the bottom line, you're sharing your your passion around what it is you do, I think there's a need to share more of how you do it and why it's science and what makes it a rigorous process. And I think that's new. And that's been a shift I've seen in recent times. But I don't know if I answered the full question.
Okay.
Is there another nuance to that? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like, do you have to account for I have to imagine you have to account for people's politics when you're making a game plan for how to engage them, right? So it's like, do you engage with, and this is a broad sweep, but do you engage with Republicans differently than you engage with Democrats?
No, so that is a great question, and I can answer it from the perspective of also having worked to train and coach scientists to go into meetings with policymakers of different parties and trying to figure it out how to go about it. I remember being actually in a training where I was working with grad students and encouraging them to set up a meeting with Senator Inhofe's staff from Oklahoma, who's way out there climate denier, and how do how do you approach that if you're a scientist and you're coming at it from a scientific, and what you want to share is the science of climate change. And I think, yes, there's nuance and difference in how you would approach it, but it's knowing your audience and knowing your audience really, really well. And it's not necessarily changing what you would share, what you want to say, but it's starting with trying to figure out where there is common ground before you come in with where there's not common ground. And the receptivity for even very hard, unlikely conversations around climate change, where there may be real differences in political opinion. I think if you can figure out what is it that this decision maker, what matters to their constituency in a very specific way. So you might want to go in and talk about the science of climate change, but what they're really dealing with is an increase in a certain disease outbreak that's affecting crops that's linked to climate change. But I wouldn't, as a science communicator in that setting, start with the climate change. I would start with the very specific, how is this showing up and why does it matter in your lives and the lives of your constituents? And then, work your way backwards to the science. And so again, it's, yes, there are differences, but it all comes down to knowing your audience and where there is common ground. And my belief is that there is ways to have very productive science conversations and find that common ground.
Can you just talk a little bit more on that? Because I think that's a question that I get more than any other question, is like, how do I communicate about tough issues like climate change or vaccine when people are really entrenched in their positions, especially I think with policymakers, when they have to be, their concerns are maybe very different than our concerns and what they can handle. So, I think what I heard from you is like, start with the common ground and know, and this is what I've heard from a lot of people that work with policymakers, is like, the more you can know about what motivates them, what they want, what their constituents want, what would look good for them, the better off you would be. But I'm just interested, like, can you elaborate a little bit more on, like, let's say like we're talking about climate change. So you're like, focus on the thing that they care about. What else is this?
So no, it's a great question. And it's, I'll sort of caveat with it is not an easy one. And I can't claim expertise on this, but I'll share, from my experience, yes, common ground. I think letting go of the notion that you're going to go in and change their mind and that science is going to change their mind is a really, really hard one for scientists. I think this, thinking about who you are as a scientist and science representing an objective truth in those conversations may or may not matter at all. And so the more you can sort of recognize that coming in and know that what success might look like is in that conversation to have science be a piece of what that decision maker is now considering among all of the other values that are and drivers that are at play at that decision. And so I think that underscores the need to do it. So to making that science won't be part of the decision if you don't show up and have that hard conversation. But I think letting go of the notion that science is going to be game changing in those conversations is also really important. And then the other piece that I think is helpful is also recognizing when and where scientists may not be the best messengers on some of this. And so thinking about how to join with other, if you're already distrusted in a space, then it's going to be a very hard conversation to have. So how do you kind of align yourself with other trusted people who might be more trusted as messengers to that community if you're starting from a place of a lot of distrust and kind of looking for the common ground there. So I think those are two thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is moving in like the direction, and I see some comments in the group chat, and we're going to answer those. And also, again, it's way easier if you just raise your hand and ask the question yourself. But I'm just wondering if you have like, let's like talk about like some best practices in general. I know each specific instance is unique, but there have to be
Sure.
some like, like knowing your audience and doing good
Doing
research.
your
I'm
homework.
writing some things down that you're saying. So like
Yeah.
knowing your audience and doing some research ahead of time to try to, figure out their motivations, trying to find some common ground, shifting your expectations. Like, again, you're not there to change minds or educate. You just want to have like some science be part of the decision-making process, and, like recognizing when scientists aren't the best communicators. Any other like general tips for engaging with policymakers, regardless of on what and who?
Um, Being sensitive to timing and policy windows opening and closing. So this is a tricky one. It kind of comes with doing your homework, but the reception to your science will be a lot greater, and you as a scientist, if it's well aligned with issues that are currently on a decision maker's plate. So understanding some of this comes with kind of understanding some of the cycles that drive a policymaker's life. So whether they be, bills in committee or in hearing or tied to the budget process. So they're different entry points for science into conversations, and understanding where their policy windows are opening and closing and timing it that way. And again, there's, nuance and homework that goes with it, but some general best practices I think are getting acquainted with kind of the rhythms of the federal budget process, and kind of how committees are structured, and then that's at the federal level, and knowing that at the state level the timelines are all different and it depends on the state, but there are concrete answers to like when are the best times to engage as a scientist with decision makers based on some of these predictable kind of cycles, and who you're meeting with. And I think also knowing that basically policymaking is conversations between humans who are really excited to have conversations with you. So, it's not like you need to know all this to go in and have those initial conversations. A lot of times that comes out through the course of a conversation. What's currently on your plate? What do you see coming down the pike? How, here's where I'm at with my research now. This may not be helpful now, but what do you see as potential entry points down the road? So these relationships are along a continuum and a process, whether you're sitting on the scientist side of the equation or the policymaker side of the equation. So becoming, as a scientist, a resource for a policymaker that they'll go back and call when they need advice, even if it's not the right time for that right now.
Yeah, that's great. That's a lot of good.
That's a lot.
Yeah, no, but it's good. Like I have no idea. Okay, there's a question. How do you see trained social sciences entering the boundary spanning work? What strengths can be leveraged from this background?
So great question. And I think it depends on, sort of which discipline within the social sciences. So it's not, I would say it's definitely not, universal what those answers would be. I think there is many branches of social scientists are under engaged in some of the policy conversations, and that there's a lot of opportunities for social scientists to be more engaged. Economists, I would say, are very well represented within the social sciences in terms of the science policy conversation. Sociologists, anthropologists, behavioral psychologists. I think there's this whole spectrum of the social sciences that are less engaged in some of the policy conversations I've been in that have huge potential to be more so. I have been working closely, or I've just started to get to know a network called the Scholar Strategies Network, which is a network of social scientists who are working as resources for decision making, and trying to do some of this at scale around mobilizing the resources of the social science community more effectively for decision making. And so we've been putting our heads together. My expertise and background is more in the natural sciences, so we've been putting our heads together a bit to think about complementarity, because I think the ways in which the breadth of the social scientists enter some of these conversations are different, but there's a lot of overlap. So that answered.
Yeah. Sarah Loftus, raising your hand, asking your own question. Let's hear it. I love it. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I'm interested in a lot of these science policy fellowships, and as someone who's only worked in academia, it's kind of very abstract when they give these descriptions of scientists helping policymakers making informed decisions. And I was just wondering if you could give a concrete example in any of your roles that kind of gives a little more detail to these broad abstract.
Sure. So I'll give an example from the time I spent on Capitol Hill. And this was a long time ago now, dating myself, I'm old. But I worked on the fisheries subcommittee in the House Resources Committee. And it was a year that we were trying to reauthorize the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And I was sort of dumped in the middle of, okay, it's your job to try to go figure out I was working for the Democratic minority at the time, figure out the alternate bill language for what a Democratic alternative for the Marine Mammal Protection Act might look like. I realized pretty quickly that this was about as far from science or an academic science or anything I knew about how I was supposed to be engaging and using my science skills in it. What I realized after working on it for a little while, because I did a little bit of programming in MATLAB during my dissertation work, on jellyfish biomechanics. And I realized at one point that writing a bill had more in common with computer programming than it had with anything else. Because if you've ever looked at kind of the structure of a bill, it's not a whole lot of words. It's a whole lot of C line 12 that amends line 56, that then amends line, other act C, authorized in 1992 and so there's a lot of so I realized, it was kind of an aha moment for me, because I realized that I was engaging a part of my academic brain, but not in a way that I ever expected. So I would say, particularly with being transplanted from, a pretty basic science PhD program to the Hill, it was basically cultural immersion in you're just working as a policymaker. And the reason it sounds abstract as a scientist is that what it's really, really hard to appreciate from the outside, what is the work of a policymaker in a given day. It's a whole lot of meetings. If you're on a committee, it's trying to write bill language that looks like MATLAB code. But it's not, I think it's incredibly normal to read those descriptions and be like, I have no idea what that means I would be doing in a day-to-day basis. And I don't think I did either until I was smack in the middle of it. I'll share another example. So this was many, many years later, when I was at Compass. I was asked to do a 6-month assignment at the White House Council of Environmental Quality. And that was for a very, very specific purpose. So we'd been working with the community of scientists who were trying to understand how to operationalize the concept of ecosystem services, so valuing natural capital in decision making. And we'd spent a lot of time with this community trying to wrangle, trying to make that science more decision relevant and bring those scientists in contact with decision makers. And that resulted in a direct ask from CEQ to basically say, well, this is great that you're helping bring meetings of scientists to meet with us, but what we need is someone sitting on the inside who can do this from the inside and figure out how to get the science in this community actually into policy guidance that we're developing. And so that was a much more, I think, direct use of science in decision making in a way that translated from experiences in the science community to the policy community. But that happened many, many years later.
Okay, we've got a really good one. What has your experience been with relaying information generated from specific agencies like the NSF, NASA, NIH to other boundary organizations and or the hands of stakeholders and policy makers? And how do you close the feedback loop with those agencies to tell them what the most useful information would be as far as what's coming from them?
Okay, so let me see if I'm understanding the question right. So are you asking more, when agencies put out kind of documents like the National Climate Assessment, how does that information then translate, or
let's just
help me narrow the question?
I don't know. We'll have to, you're gonna have to potentially chat with us, Peter
Yeah.
Osman. But I'm actually interested in, like, so when the NSF puts out, a report, how does that go from like being an NSF report to being like on policymakers' desks? And what does that, how much are they really paying attention to those?
How much are they paying attention to even their own scientists, right? So is that the question, is like, how much does the government, where is the feedback loop between kind of the science coming out of the federal agencies and how it's been feeding back into.
Yeah, because I'm interested in like, okay, NSF made this report. How does the report go to policymaker?
Yep, that's a great question. It's kind of a hard one to answer and I can answer it from a couple different anecdotes. One is from the perspective of an outside organization working to bring both academic and government scientists in contact with policymakers. So over the years, I was involved in organizing a couple different briefings where we included both academic scientists and like a scientist from USGS or a scientist from NOAA in the mix. And that actually gave those scientists an opportunity to brief directly to policymakers in a way that they wouldn't necessarily from within their federal agencies. So within the federal agency structure, there's a pretty strict hierarchy for kind of how information passes up the chain. And the scientists that are sort of the closest to actually doing the science may never be the ones to go directly brief policymakers on it, but they will be the ones to be briefing up their chain. So it's equally important for those scientists to be effective at distilling the what does this actually mean and why does it matter? Because the goal is for it to reach the administrator of the agency in a way that they can then go take to use in other ways. And so there's sort of two different answers there, which is one kind of internal to the agency, how is it making its way up, and what's the responsibility of a scientist to be communicating effectively themselves to make sure that it goes up, and then what are the opportunities for government scientists to be part of direct briefings. That said, Capitol Hill at any time can ask for briefings from the USGS or other federal agencies, or NASA or NOAA, and they will hear from them every year as part of the budget process. But I think there are more opportunities where kind of just the science that's coming out from the federal agencies could be reaching back to decision makers. The pathways aren't always that clear. Does that get at this question?
Yeah, I think so. All right, so let's just have some more like general. So I think you've done this a little bit by telling us the best practices for when you're engaging with the science, but like, what are some of the most common mistakes you see from scientists when they're engaging with policymakers?
I think going back to the coming in with too much arrogance or assuming that they're going that or with the assumption that their science is going to directly change minds, and sort of not really appreciating the role of science as part of a decision-making palette, and not a like, this is what the science says, therefore this is what you should do, I would say is probably the number one. And I've seen this a lot. I've seen it go really south, with scientists who are not prepared to kind of tone down their communications around kind of thinking about their audience. And I think it's also assuming that.
What do you mean go south? Tell us more.
What? So I think it goes with the assumption. So policymakers may not know your field in depth as a scientist, but they are incredibly smart and they're incredibly resourceful, and many of them are actually subject matter experts themselves. So I think it's the making an assumption about who you're meeting with that is incorrect, and sort of starting at a level where you're talking down to them. And I think that's where I've seen it go south, where you'll see it in a meeting with, their body language will just be like, oh gosh, I'm being explained to by a scientist who thinks that they know everything better. And I think there are ways to redirect that, but I also think it's a conversation worth having before having those meetings in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because, as a group of this group of scientists who are in the room now, who are being remarkably shy today, know that, you know, this information deficit model is dead, right? Which is, if you're not sure of what that means, it's just that giving people just facts and information is not an effective way to persuade. It's also not how we as humans make our decisions, unfortunately. And I think one thing I've learned from journalism is that, you know, even I, who I'm like, well, I'm a scientist, so it's hard for me because I do make my decisions based on facts and information, and data does change my mind, is also like kind of a little lie that I tell myself, you know, because I think I more than generally, like, I love when I'm surprised and wrong and data changes my mind, but still in like your everyday gut instinct, you know, decision making, and this is why social science is so important, those decisions aren't made from a fact sheet, right? And those decisions aren't made based on you just telling me your materials and methods section. Like, so I think like in any form of communication, if your goal is to persuade, you have to come from it from an area where it's like, it can't be a data only decision. You can use some data, but yeah, I mean, I think it's the same mistake that scientists make when engaging with anybody, is to basically be like, okay, well, first of all, let's get to the facts first, second, and third. And reality is, you know, that's how we've gotten into a couple of situations we're in right now. You know, I'm doing a piece about anti-vaccination right now, and what has become abundantly clear is if public health officials and CDC were as effective as anti-vaxxers at messaging, we would be in a different situation. So, like, I think the first thing to do is just like realize when you're working with a policymaker that this is a human being that has their own sets of demands. And, you know, you've got to like get in and hit them in the areas that they really care about. There was one scientist that I was, one of my friends who was a scientist and is now in policy and is now in pharma. And he was like, you can't go in there and tell them why the science is so important. You can go in there and be like, hey, Brazil is spending more money on science than we are per capita. Do you want to be behind Brazil? Is that it? Do you not think America's the best? And like, I would never think that would be the argument you would use for funding. But they're like, meet these people where they're at, know where their motivations are. And so it's a big one.
And I would say another one is never underestimate the power of storytelling with policymakers. I know this is true with science communication in general, but some of the most effective, if you watch senators on the floor, there's some master storytellers that are elected officials. And I think stories really, really resonate, especially when they can be told locally and specifically. And so constituents often communicate with their decision makers through kind of anecdote and story about what they're experiencing in their world. And to whatever extent, you know, you as a scientist can put some, you know, narrative, personal narrative, all of that into how you approach the conversation, it really connects. And they want to be able to hear your stories to tell them elsewhere. So the more the things that are sticky are just, this is general with communication, but it's really true with policy communication.
So we have one question. So this person is currently in the California Sea Grant Fellowship and they want to make the move to the East Coast. How would you suggest reaching out to networks of people that aren't, you know, within your own networking opportunities?
So I think it's just a question of trying to understand your network and where there's mobility within the network. So reaching out just directly to fellows that you're interested in meeting with. So the fellows to fellows communication tends to be very, very supportive. So if you're in California and you want to talk to, you know, anyone within the AAAS Fellows Network or this actually says that you're currently a Sea Grant Fellow. So the Knaus, the broader Knaus network of fellows, incredibly friendly bunch, would, you know, welcome conversations directly. I think one general principle around networking that's really, really true about policy, especially in the DC world, is that people are moving from position to position all the time, and they tend to resurface in just as interesting roles as you first met them in. So figuring out how to build and maintain relationships with the people and not necessarily the position is, I think for me has been, really transformative. Like there are people that I've met, a decade and a half ago that have moved through 4 different policy roles, and I've had a chance to work with them in each of their different roles. And I think that's really focusing on kind of the people rather than the positions, but just kind of reaching out and using the networks to help you make those initial connections. I don't know if that helps.
Erica, can I also ask for someone who isn't a current fellow right now and just wants to start tapping into these types of networks, but really doesn't understand the landscape, is there a resource for where they should get started?
Yeah, so I have a few kind of specific suggestions around resources. One is there's a relatively new organization called the National Science Policy Network, which is a network. It's a student-led science policy network that's organized in regional hubs. I think they're about 3 years old. They put together a meeting once a year in November. But they're a really interesting group because they're basically function to help young early career scientists kind of get their first exposure and make connections in the policy network. Another really good resource is ESEP, which is Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy, which is an ad hoc coalition of organizations. Both Compass and the National Council for Science and the Environment are members, and they've been maintaining a resource database that right now has, I think, like 230 different opportunities around both fellowships and networks and sort of like-minded organizations. So that's another really good resource. And then I'll also mention there are a growing number of organizations that are really focused on helping scientists engage locally. There's one called ESAL, Engaging Scientists something locally. I forget what the A is, but I can follow up on that. But I think it's way more accessible in the past 5 years than I think it's ever been. And there's been, I think, a genuine effort. I think the bigger science societies and groups, there's been a genuine collaborative effort to figure out how to really mobilize those resources and make them accessible to more people. So it's not all about the one science policy fellowship as a first starting point, whereas I feel like it used to be much more kind of bottlenecked there.
And everybody will put together a resource sheet that Kimberly and Erica and I will work on, and we'll put one in the mentor chat when we post this video, just so you know, so you don't have to frantically take notes, or you can. That's up to you. Honestly, as scientists, I'm not sure that you can stop yourself. So there was a good question from Nancy. Are there any mistakes you made early in your career that you think we might learn from? And we've got 4 or 5 hours if you want to really lean into all the mistakes you make as a young policy person.
Yeah, no, so many. What's a good one? I mean, I guess I'll go back to the example I shared about, I shared the aha moment of realizing that writing legislation was like writing MATLAB code, but there was a really long period of kind of clueless bumbling that I think preceded that aha moment of where you really felt dumped in the deep end. And like I had no idea what the drivers and constraints were of the policymaker. I thought, here I was, a newly minted PhD, like, clearly I've been in school for 6 years. I should have something, to offer this. And really feeling like for the first few months that I had no idea what that was or why, what it was that it could provide. And I feel like that feeling repeats itself all the time, right? So no matter, and maybe this is just sort of the nature of imposter syndrome that we all share at some point in our career, but I think with every new environment, it's a big challenge. I mean, there is a period of like fish out of water. I think that's the nature of boundary spanning, is you're consistently a fish out of water, because I've intentionally put myself in an uncomfortable intersection where it's never quite, I'm not quite in one world, I'm not quite in another world. So I would say early in my career, that was a really uncomfortable place. Later in my career, it became like my comfort zone was leaning into the discomfort of being in the boundary and knowing that after many years of doing it, I had some expertise in helping others make those connections. But you want, like, I'd have to think about like a really good grisly example of a really embarrassing mistake, but I'll think on it.
How do you, that's something that I think we all deal with. And I don't know, I feel like science policy is so not just like there's so much going on. It's so vague. Like, did you feel like you were able to, when you were in that position, did you like, and I assume you're with other like scientists and stuff, and did you guys just kind of like look around and be like, do you guys know what's going on? Like, was there a community for that? And like, how did you deal with that imposter syndrome? Because I think that happens, like you said, every time.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. And I think I think everybody initially wants to pretend like wants to pretend that it's not happening and feels like they're the only one who must experience it. So, it must be something wrong with me. Why is this so hard? But I think once you can find a way to have that conversation, I think there's a supportive community. I think I'll reflect back just for a moment at the director at Washington Sea Grant who supported me to apply for my first policy fellowship. I remember him sitting me down and being like, you could take a position in the executive branch, or you could apply for a legislative fellowship. And an executive branch, I was like, oh, there's so many cool places to go in the executive branch. I could go to the Office of Undersea Research in NOAA. And, I knew a fellow that got to, dive in a submersible in that. And he looked at me, and I'm going through all the reasons why I wanted to work in the executive branch, because it was way more within my comfort zone as a scientist in terms of the kinds of placements. And he looked at me, he was like, you should go to the Hill. And here's why. Like, view it as a period, like, you're going to feel like you're in a foreign country trying to speak a language that you don't speak. And you're going to feel like that for most of the year. And in the end, you will have gained a sense of, you may never, ever, ever want to do it again. And when I left the Hill, I was like, I could not see myself being a Hill staffer long-term in any way, shape, or form. But I've never been more appreciative of having had the opportunity to understand, to having been a guest in that foreign land, because what it gave me in terms of the ability to understand how science does and doesn't fit into it could not have been achieved otherwise. And so I think that was a concrete example of where leaning into the discomfort of knowing I was going to be a total fish out of water and not sure I was going to like it at all, ended up being a really valuable learning experience.
So we have one last question, and I think it spans, like, it's a little bit bigger than just, so somebody was saying, like, if you're interested in, like, you're trying to figure out where your next move is, science policy or science outreach, like, what are the difference between those things? And I think that's so vague and they're so large, but I guess, like, the question is probably, what kind of people what kind of things should you care about if you want to be a science policy person? Is it really like you get into science policy because you want to change legislation, or you want to change the laws and the way that the world sees science, versus just like engaging and getting people excited about science? Like, if you're thinking, like, is science policy right for me? What are the kinds of things that you're going to be able to tackle, or what are the kind of motivations that you should have if you're entering that space? That was a terrible question, but I know you could do it.
So I would say both bins, science outreach and science policy, are big bins, right? And so I think, there are lots of ways to be in either space that, look nothing like each other. I would say a primary distinction for me would be, science outreach to me feels more like, you're still more on the science side of the equation, and you're trying to figure out where communicating science more effectively and reaching more people can inform conversations. When I think about science policy, or I think what excites me the most about it, is when I can actually understand how different levers of change and power. So, like, where are the influencers in a particular space within decision making? And they're all over the place. And so I think in science policy, understanding comes more from a desire to understand pathways towards to more specific changes, rather than sort of more general, getting more science out there. So science policy to me means more like you're really trying to have the science underpin certain changes you're trying to make in the world. No, that's not a very good answer, but
no, I mean, I get
that can do with it.
Like, if you just want to get, if you want to communicate science in cool ways and get people excited, and, you know, have more of maybe, you know, an informing an education route. Outreach might be the thing. But what it sounds like you're telling me is there's, you know, there's not necessarily so much about like communicating the details of the science at a science policy level. It's going to be a lot more about like understanding like policymakers and how laws and how bills and all that stuff works, and like who's making the decisions and what. And so maybe you're not like, you know, explaining exciting science all the time versus outreach where you might be doing more of that. Is that fair?
I think it's you're less in a role of explaining science, but you're more in the role of using it substantively and strategically. So like understanding where if science is not part of the process, is something bad going to happen, and where can more science effectively contributed to the process really benefit a productive outcome. So it's less about the general, and it's much more about this very, you know, specific. It kind of comes full circle into kind of knowing the decision context and the audience more specifically. But I think it's similar in a lot of ways, and I think they're both really rewarding kind of routes with a lot of intersection.
Yeah. All right. Well, if it's 2:01. Erica, thank you so much for coming. You are awesome. I am so excited that we got to spend time with you. Everybody, I will post this in the Mentor Chat channel so you can revisit it. And we're also going to work with Erica just to put together a list of resources, especially those as far as like, how do I get involved in this? Because it seems like that's a lot of what you guys are interested in. So, I'm seeing lots of thanks yous come in the chat. Erica, you're amazing.
Oh, thank you
so much.
Thanks for having me. It was great to spend the hour with you.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.